So, and I'm going to start off with some controversy. So it's so cool to be in person for one of these sessions. So sorry for those of you online. There are advantages there too, and we're going to talk about both of those. So really, again, I actually came through this facility with my good friend John Tutors, who is absent today. I just have to say that out loud. That was for him, no one else. But I actually came through the facility in the middle of COVID, whenever there was nobody here. And I have to tell you that the energy in the room today, and food helps, but the energy in the room is just fantastic. And we're going to get you engaged both online and in the room. I've been studying this concept. Don't ask me how I got here, but you know, I really, back in my days at Bank of America, and I've been really studying this concept of how networks matter. How networks matter to performance, how networks matter to innovation, how our connections help to drive both performance, discovery, innovation, and frankly, your career, although I won't get too much into that one today. And then came along this thing, you know, just over 3 years ago called this pandemic. And all of a sudden we realized how much our connections matter. So that's what I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey. I'm going to take you on this journey of what happened through the pandemic, what we've discovered, and most importantly, what should we do about that now? And how has the future of work changed? I believe we'll look back on this 5-year period in history, including the 3 that have already passed. We'll look back on these 5 years and probably, and especially in your space, you know, those of you driving innovation, we will probably move forward 50 years into the future as it relates to how human beings come together to make certain things happen in the future of work. So that's the journey I'm going to take you on. I've already said our connections matter. Microsoft did a great service to the world, in my opinion, with some pretty comprehensive studies where they looked at, you know, millions of data sets, you know, mostly through email and Teams and other insights. And basically what they determined is what we've already, social scientists have known for years, but we could put into practice. And that is that, you know, your connections, whether you have thriving relationships or just adequate relationships, matter to everything from your overall well-being to your overall performance to whether or not you're satisfied or stressed out in the workplace. One thing that's missing here that is really critical is the concept of innovation. You know, your relationships are really essential to how innovation emerges. And most importantly, how do you get ideas scaled into a system and across the system? So I'm going to try to substantiate much of this, you know, throughout the presentation. But to do that, I have to get a little geeky on you for a moment. And I have to talk about different types of relationships or connections, because all relationships, anyone that says collaborate more is the right solution is lying to you, or they're selling software solutions to you, which I won't mention any of those company names, but you know them. You know, there are plenty of times where collaborating less is the better solution. And, you know, the type of connections you have matters immensely. There are 2 primary types of social capital I'll talk about today. One is what we call bonding social capital. Bonding social capital, quite simply, is how tightly connected are you with other in-group members? Call them teams if you prefer. How tightly connected are you with other people inside of your team? And I'll talk about how that showed up in the virtual world in a moment. It really matters. These are critical for 2 primary reasons. One, small, you know, super cohesive teams with bonding social capital can move really fast. The agile literature says up to 10x faster. That matters if you're trying to get something into the world quickly. And then the second thing is, you know, it's one of the ways we're more productive. It's not a surprise that we were more productive in the midst of a pandemic than we were pre-pandemic. And I'll tell you why in a moment. But then there's a different type of connections that also matter, and we call those bridging connections. Bridging connections are where you get new insights, where you get novel learnings, where you discover from someone else in the system. And you can see in these blue dots or these blue circles, you know, it's the linkage between 2 teams or the linkage between a partner, a client, a customer, or even someone else out in the world. And I'll talk more about these in a few moments. And that's really where we discover new insights. Sandy Pentland's work up at the MIT Media Lab would suggest you can discover up to 25% more insights if you've got more bridging connections. And it's also how scaling new ideas happens. And I'll talk more precisely about each of these. Why do I have to delineate the differences? Because they showed up radically different in the early days of the pandemic. Turns out your bonding connections actually increased up to 15 to 20% immediately into the pandemic. So the moment you were sent home, the moment you went working, virtually, what happened was, and this is almost universal, is you anchored into your teams and you started to think about what are the most critical deliverables on our plate right now? How are we going to make those things happen? And what happened was you anchored into your teams, but you can see what happened with your bridging connections, right? Your bridging connections dropped off the planet by as much as 30%. Why does that matter? Well, I just shared with you, this is where new ideas come from. This is where new discoveries come from. This is where the ability to scale ideas come from. And we started to see that all over the world in the early days of the pandemic. So these different types of connections responded differently to virtual work. Reality is it's very hard to build bonding social capital virtually, but it's actually quite easy to sustain it. The reality is it's not nearly as easy to sustain the bridging connections in a virtual world. And I'll talk about both of those here in a few moments, but let me talk about how our networks changed throughout the pandemic. And I won't get into each of these, but these are all different use cases, different studies that we conducted. We've looked at hundreds of different organizations now across the last 3 years. And what we discovered was in the early days, something that we called the neighborhood effect. Bridging, we lost bridging connections, and we didn't just remain siloed from other divisions and other functions within our companies, but we actually became silos within silos, or more neighborhood-like. And what that meant was, the fabric of the overall organization began to break down, which had huge consequences on things like innovation. And later, what we started to see were things like energy burnout. It's not a mistake that it's not by pure chance, I should say, that we started to have this thing called, the great exit, or, people leaving, the great resignation, I think we called it. And then it's not by mistake or chance that later came quiet quitting. And a lot of this can be traced back to network patterns in regards to what happened in the world. More recently, and the only thing I'm trying to substantiate is our networks have changed drastically throughout the pandemic and now the return to work. And more recently, what we're seeing is the opposite, is what I call the activity avalanche, which is we were holding back the floodgates of all these things that were happening over the essential time when we were all working remotely. And now all those priorities, they didn't go away. They just got stalled or pushed back. Now two things are happening. People are gathering back together like this, and those priorities that were being held off for years have now found their way into the strategic agenda. And what we're starting to see in the network is much more of a blob in regards to there's so much activity hitting the network that we're overwhelming and overloading human beings in such a way that we're probably diluting speed once again, but yet for different reasons. Our networks are incredibly dynamic. And what I intend to share with you is how we can think about that much more intentionally, and how you can help your clients and you can help your organizations think about this much more intentionally in regards to, form follows function. What is the form of network I need to drive any given output or function? And that's what I intend to substantiate. And just to give you one snapshot, like this was pre-pandemic, this is a really healthy innovation network. You can see a lot of cluster in there. That means we can do things fast and deliver. Scrum, building, use a lot of sprints in this case, lots of bridge connections. But very early on in the pandemic, what you saw, it's hard to see up here, but very early on, what you saw was the erosion of these bridge connections. And along with that came the inability to scale ideas and the inability to find new ideas, at least as fluidly as you had in the past. So this is my fun slide. This is where I often say, and I will apologize in advance for anyone who has this as their strategy, those who say, come back in the office 2 days a week are ludicrous. I don't have a better way of saying it. Like, that's nonsense in many regards. Here's why. It's a bit like playing the social lottery. You will increase your odds, but not by very much. In other words, you will increase your odds of a serendipitous encounter, but as I show you with the research throughout this presentation, only slightly, and there's a much better way than 2 days a week. And just to run the simple probability math, chances of discovery improve by maybe 4%. That's not an X, that's a percent sign behind there. So maybe you include discovery, serendipity, we'll call it, by about 4%. Yeah, good news is you get a little bit better bump in cohesion or development, which I'll talk more about in a few moments, because you're with your teams. You get maybe a little bit of a better improvement in scaling, although it's something less. I can't do the real math on this one because I don't actually know who's bumping into who, but your chances of bumping into the right person to scale your ideas without more intentionality are at 16% or something probably significantly less. And then finally, that all comes at a cost of about 20% in productivity. Have I pissed anybody off yet? Sorry. I don't know how you set up your work configurations. I hope that it maps to this. I hope that it's not demanding 2 days randomly a week. I plan to substantiate each of these 4 and try to challenge you to think about what in fact are some of the actions you can take to become much more intentional. Cool? I have to engage you, like we're in, yes, you're good with that? Okay. Here's the point. Proximity matters in the network. Proximity matters immensely in the network. In fact, I would have told you pre-pandemic that productivity would tank if we went to a virtual working environment. I would have told you that. I was wrong, clearly. And I would have said that because most of the studies were focused on proximity and productivity. Turns out that proximity matters, but intentionality trumps proximity. And there are things that we can do virtually that we never dreamt of before. And there are some things that getting back together face-to-face really matter. But if we just snap back to the way things were before, we only have the odds of what I just shared a few moments ago, or maybe slightly better. And frankly, we weren't that good at this stuff pre-pandemic. So going back to the way it was doesn't make any sense with everything that we've learned. So I want to take you on this journey and talk about, okay, so how should we think about this? And to do that, I need to, first of all, substantiate why intentionality matters. So it's a great study recently done by Gardner. And what Gardner looked at was a pretty comprehensive, I pulled one dimension out, a pretty comprehensive analysis of things like empathy. I know there's a lot of innovators here, design thinkers, things like empathy in your leadership even, and a number of other aspects, async versus synchronous working. And what they found was the single characteristic that created the greatest impact or lift, 2x lift versus the other variables, was those teams that were more intentional about when they were face-to-face and when they weren't actually improved productivity. They did not study innovation in this study. But the point I'm trying to make is being thoughtful and intentional about how and when to get together at the team level, which is really critical, really matters. And what we know is we can elevate discovery, speed, and influence in addition to productivity. And that's, again, the journey I hope to take you on. That requires us to think about work differently. It requires us to think about what kind of work are you doing in any given moment. It requires us to bring in some science and think about what I'll call the proximity advantages here in a few moments, like when should we be together, for what purpose? It requires us to think about a set of critical practices. And then ultimately, there are some things we can do that just are dysfunctional, even virtually, that could stifle everything I'm about to say. So if you work on a really bad team, sorry. Everything I say doesn't matter. It's still a really bad team. If you work for a really bad leader, really sorry. It still matters that dysfunctions can overwhelm each of these practices I'm about to share, which you obviously know already. But let me take you on this journey. So here's what I call the form follows function model. And this is what we've been studying. We've got a lot of analysis on this. I'll share case studies with you. I'm going to engage you in a few moments in an interaction, as well as those of you online. But there are times where you're in discovery mode. Like, I need to learn something else. That requires a different set of connections. It's when you're trying to create new possibilities, maybe at the front end of a new project, if you're an implementation team, or maybe if you're an innovation team, this is when you're doing empathy and you're out in the field. There's a time where you're in development, like I'm heads down. I don't need more ideas. I need to make sure that I can prove these ideas, and I'm going to experiment and iterate and test and go through Scrum or sprints or whatever that methodology is. There's a time where you've proven that, and I need to scale, and I need to now take it onto this one little pocket or this one team and get it spread across the broader organization. And then finally, there's a time where all that makes sense, and now all I've got to do is go deliver. I've got to deliver on behalf of the customer on an ongoing basis. Each of these different purposes requires different network configurations. And what I want to try to really attune you to today is to think about this form follows function model by starting with what's the intention? What am I trying to do? Am I in development mode, or am I in, use whatever language you want. This language can be universal, or you can say, am I trying to scale? Am I trying to build? It matters because who you interact with matters as a result of that. And if you're mixing your model, what you get is failure. And I'm going to prove that at the very end of this presentation. And these require different types of connections, bridging and bonding again, here we go. Discovery and diffusion are much more working outside the team. Delivery and development are much more working within the team. And then you span, different continuums based on what you're trying to produce. And there's some science behind, well, there's lots of science behind this. I'm only going to share some science with you today behind this. And there are certain ways that you can actually create serendipity. And actually, I don't even believe in serendipity, by the way, so it's amazing that I'm using that word. There are ways that you can seed the network to increase the likelihood of discovery, which we sometimes call serendipity. But the ways you do that matter. There are ways that you can actually increase influencing with other human beings, and that matters. And I'll go through each of these advantages in a little more detail. But let's start here. And I got to have a little fun with you. I don't know, we're in Charlotte today. I don't know if there's anybody, I'm going to give you a California story, actually a Hawaii story, but it comes from the coast of California first. And I don't know if anyone's seen this documentary. It's an HBO documentary called Momentum Generation. And what can we learn about innovation from surfers? Well, a lot, to be short. And if you're not a surfer and you don't know these pictures, you don't know who's in here, these are some of the most famous surfers of all time. In fact, Kelly Slater's in the middle of that picture, and you can see Kelly Slater is 11-time world champion. You can see Shane Doran, who's considered to be the greatest big wave surfer of all time. You can see Ralph Macchio, who's considered to be the greatest freestyle surfer, and then the greatest power surfer in Tyler Knox. And then the list goes on and on and on. Why do I share a story about surfers? Because this group, a couple times a year, serendipitously, spread from Australia to Cocoa Beach, Florida, to the west coast of the United States, would gather on the North Shore of Hawaii, and they would spend time at Ben Weather, this real picture, Ben Weatherby's house, Weatherly's house, and they would learn how to surf from one another. So they went there because there were these big giant waves and everybody can learn to surf. But what they really did was it became a echo chamber of discovery. It became a set of bridging connections from across the globe where this group could gather just for an instant, a couple times a year, and learn different styles. They were huge competitors with each other, and there was a lot of testosterone flowing whenever they were out surfing, which didn't hurt the competition, and they would learn techniques and challenge each other. From that came this whole generation of radical surfers that we had never seen before. Innovation works a bit like this. If you stay within the bubble, the blob, the safety of your own confines, you learn very little. And what you do learn is risk averse at best. You may nudge it one step forward, but your ability to discover something really different requires you to create a new pipeline of discovery. And just to prove this point, this is a network analysis done in 2012. You can't see it very well, sorry, but just above 6 o'clock, you see one node. I talk in nodes and edges if you're interested, or links and dots if you prefer. And you can see a guy by the name of Steve Jobs. This is Apple's patent network in the year of 2012, which unfortunately was the year Steve Jobs passed away. And one of the things you notice right away is that Steve Jobs wasn't the most connected inside of this patent network. Steve Jobs didn't have the largest network, but what he did have was the most diverse set of connections, or what he had was a bridging position. So my argument is you would oftentimes describe Steve Jobs as someone who was innovative, a strategic genius, and he was all those things. But I'm trying to counter argue that perspective and say his network did most of that thinking for him. Reality is, and this is the internal network, which was really great for scaling. Turns out his external network, which we don't have access to, was even better for discovery. And Steve Jobs was famous for picking up the phone and calling any entrepreneur in the Valley at any point in time, and they would be in his office in the afternoon. And what he was really doing was learning and discovering. So what Ron Burt, a sociologist, tells us, a very well-known sociologist tells us, is that these people, Steve Jobs people, have three advantages in the network. They have access to early information sooner than you, if you're not a broker. They have access to novel information, which is they have access to diverse and novel information. So they have the second one being they're connected to a multitude of different groups, so they can translate and communicate different languages to different groups. And then the third one is they have control over the diffusion of those ideas. These three competitive advantages actually make those individuals worth 3x more to their companies. I'm not going to talk a lot about careers, but literally you will perform better, you will be paid more, and you will be promoted more frequently with this position in the network. So here's what I'm going to do. First activity, just to get some energy flowing in the room. Those of you online, I want you to stay on Zoom, do not leave, but I want you to connect with anybody else in whatever virtual means you can to discover something new in the next minute and a half. Those of you in the room, stand up, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to get into triads, and I want you to pick a timekeeper, and I'll tell you what to do next. Pick a timekeeper, get into triads. Get into triads. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. So listen up really fast, really fast. Each of you've got 10 seconds, that's it. 10 seconds, timekeeper, keep track. Each of you have 10 seconds to share one thing you're working on right now. 10 seconds, one thing you're working on, go. Okay, stop there, stop there. So here's what I want you to do. So listen up, I know you didn't get all the time you want to, get over it. Here's what I want you to do next. Timekeepers, I want you to rotate to a different dyad so the other two stay together. I want the timekeepers to rotate to a different group and repeat the same activity. Go ahead, rotate and repeat, rotate and repeat. You can come over here, yep, good. Okay, stop there, stop there. So listen up. So here's the next step. Timekeepers, this time stay exactly where you are, but remain standing. Everybody else, timekeepers, remain where you are, stay standing. Everybody else take their seat. Timekeepers, stand. Okay, so those of you sitting, and if you can see this online, those of you sitting, look at the people standing right now. They're worth 3 times as much as you are. Take your seats, take your seats. The reality is they have access. I only did this twice. I should have done it 3 times. If we had more time, I would have taken another round. The reality is they have more access to more information than the dyads do. This is what we call a bridging person. This is a Steve Jobs profile, and it's essential to discovery. It actually helps to discover new ideas. Many of the companies we were looking at in the early days of the pandemic saw a 25 to 35% drop in the number of new ideas generated. I'm not even talking about the quality of ideas, and it plummeted because our bridging connections were lost. And now what we're seeing is as the bridging connections have forged, we're getting a plethora of new ideas, and it's starting to stall organizations out. So we got a different problem. This is really critical to discovery. And it turns out that this is exactly how Steve Jobs operated. In fact, he's famous for saying, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You only connect them looking backwards. That was his way of saying, I'm going to be insatiably curious about everything I can be, because someday it's going to pay dividends to me. And what we did was we lost this level of connectivity, cross-bridge connections, especially outside of the organization during the height of the pandemic. And it's really critical to innovation. You can sometimes be very intentional about this. So here's a design thinking story for you. I spent some time at General Motors, so this is a real story. If you are selling trucks in Texas or Kansas in the middle of the country, and yet most of the world's population is moving to urban environments, that could be a problem. Could you understand why that might be a problem? Like, that might be a problem. So if you're a group of innovators, you better go find out what you can. You better go discover what you can about this environment. And it turns out that pre-pandemic, the world's population was growing at 1.84% annually, and all of that growth was happening in urban environments. About 70% of the world's population today resides in urban environments, and it's growing year over year, and you needed to learn something about that environment. So what we did was we peeled a group off using simple design thinking, empathy stage. We sent a group of engineers out into the wild, and we asked them to go study urban environments. And we asked them to design a solution that satisfies those customers, just like you would do every day with design thinking. And what they came back with was, it might be as much of a burden as a benefit to own a vehicle inside of Manhattan. And it gets worse if you go to places like Shanghai, because in Shanghai, you have to have the license to be able to buy a vehicle, which is almost as expensive as the vehicle itself. And then you get the distinct privilege of driving it every other day, depending on if your license plate ends in an even or odd number. Oh, and by the way, after that, you get to sit in smog and congestion for at least 2 hours each trip. Yay, bravo, give me one of those, right? These folks realize that, in fact, that's a problem. And there are ways to get much more thoughtful about this. Take congestion off the streets. Think about by the way, 97% of this is, you can tell I'm no longer with an automotive company quoting these statistics. 97% of your vehicle's time is idle. Right now, it's sitting in a garage or a parking space somewhere, and that's not a good value prop for your second most expensive asset that you have. So there are ways to fix that, and this team invented a solution they called Maven. Think of Maven as Airbnb for your car, and it's a way to redeploy. It got sunsetted. I'll be completely clear. I can tell you why later, but it got sunsetted for a different reason. But this is a way to share your vehicle with other consumers, take traffic off the street, have access, unlike an Uber or Lyft, have access to the vehicle as long as you need for wherever you need to take it. And it was a solution that actually took off and scaled across 17 cities in the first year alone. Why? Because they got outside of the blob and they discovered something new. This is what matters when on the front edge of innovation. It's one of the reasons empathy is so critical to the innovation process. Amazon does this differently. Amazon doesn't use pure design thinking in the same fashion. What they do is they look for friction and white space. And they always start with the customer. And if you know anything about Amazon, they write PR FAQs, press releases, and frequently asked questions. And some young builder, some young engineer recognized that the biggest friction point in retail stores was waiting lines. And if you don't know much about this particular solution, Amazon Go is a solution where you can just take an app, swipe it through that stall, walk straight in, grab something off the shelf and walk straight out, and it automatically charges you for only the things you pick up with very high levels of accuracy and reliability. And you can do that, because I did it every day when I lived in Seattle, in a minute and a half. It might actually make it to your next meeting on time, especially if you're on Amazon where every meeting starts 5 minutes late. But the reality is this came from the PR FAQ or working backwards process. It's a complete technology play. And inside the PR FAQ, there was not a single word that mentioned technology. Why do I say that? Well, because there was a need that was discovered first. It wasn't a solution looking for a need. It was a need looking for a solution. They discovered the need using this working backwards process and then went and built the solution, which is why development matters. And that's another way of discovering. But the thing is, you've got to constantly be challenging yourself to get outside of the bubble to learn. Here's the problem. We're less and less externally exposed than we've ever been before. In the networks, what we're seeing is numbers that are less, in this case, 22%. I've seen that number down to 10%, which is scary, of people inside your network that you talk to that have an external perspective. And what that means is it was the least, in this particular survey, the least common type of advice provided in the network. We're becoming more and more insular. And what that means is less and less new ideas. And we are able to pull Viva insights, and we're able to see this inside of networks, inside of organizations, and we should not be surprised that ideas were drying up. This is starting to turn a bit, but ideas were drying up as a result of this. Here's the problem. In a virtual environment, 9 out of 10 of your new bridge connections erode within the first year. Think about it. Like somebody you may have just met today, and you really like them, like not fake like, but really like. And you're even saying to yourself, I'm going to stay connected to this person, and let's share our information, and we could go work on a project together. 9 times out of 10, that will not exist a year from today. And what that means is our bridge connections are super fragile. So we got to get very thoughtful about how to rebuild these. Coming back in the office randomly doesn't matter. Study that was done in 2022 was when you come back together, you have no discoverability from other groups. And in other words, there's little chance of you picking up anybody else's idea unless you're sitting in the same quartile on a daily basis as those other people, other teams are. In other words, what you're trying to do is get people that can learn from each other in the same proximity with one another at the same time, and you increase your odds by 4x to do that. So coming together randomly without more discipline about how to be intentional about serendipity is useless. In fact, you can see you actually get a loss in connectivity because basically what that means is you're not spending any time with those other groups and you're spending it on something else. So we saw a decrease in effect overall. It also matters how well you know the other team. Another study that was done shows that you actually double your likelihood of learning if you don't know the other team or team members. That makes sense, right? Because if you know them, you probably already learned from them. You can do that virtually. So what am I trying to say? When you come back together, think about what you're trying to learn, who you want to learn it from, and how you arrange the right configurations. You can do this through interventions. Doesn't always have to be seating, but being thoughtful about it matters. Otherwise, you don't get any effect out of it. And that's what I'm advocating for, is how do you get really intentional about coming together to drive discovery on an ongoing basis. Cool? You with me so far? Okay, so here's the problem. Ideas are cheap. Like you can have lots of ideas, but if you don't do anything with them, so what? So you got to bring them into the world. To do that, you got to pivot completely from the previous network configuration of bridging to heads down in the team with no distractions. And to do that requires a whole different set of connections. But let me ask this question, another documentary. What does Percy Sledge, I'll just pick a few, Aretha Franklin and the Rolling Stones have in common? Anyone? And add Willie Nelson if you care to, or if you want to go current day, add Chris Stapleton in this mix. Like, what do they have in common? Anyone? They're singers. That's true. That's not what I'm looking for, but absolutely true. They've all got very strong #1 hits from time to time. Here's what they have in common. Behind them, in each of the recording of each of those songs was a small backup band, a small group called the Swampers of Muscle Shoals. And it turns out that this little recording studio somewhere on the Mississippi banks in Alabama, in a place called Muscle Shoals, it's a Netflix documentary, you can go watch it. There's this group of people that look like they're called the Swampers. Bono said this, he says, they got this really funky kind of music. And Bono said, I thought I was going to see the Mississippi Mud musicians, and I thought I was going to go in and see a bunch of brothers doing backup for these bands and playing R&B. He says, and what I found was 4 dudes that looked like they should be working in the grocery store. But what happens is they have these 4 guys or 5 have super cohesion or super cohesive relationships with each other. So the front artist can focus on the creativity, and they can know that they've got the backup band that's going to catch them wherever they are and add some new nuances to things. that's going to push them. And it's this composition of new discovery, new musician coming in, and cohesion that really creates this fertile environment where there are more #1 hits recorded than I think any other place, any other recording studio, single recording studio out there. And this is what I'm talking about. You need this sort of cohesion to bring these ideas into the world. Jeff Bezos was once asked the question, how can I communicate more effectively? Jeff, how can we improve communications? And his, wise, sort of before any of us from a management theory standpoint response, he says, I don't want to communicate more effectively. I want there to be less communications. How do you do that? 2 pizza teams. Put people in small groups, and as Asana talks about, they don't talk about work, they talk about work. And they're engaged in the work, and they're delivering on the work. And the communication is an output versus an input, and they can move much more fluidly. And you already know speed comes along for the ride. And it's these 2 pizza team configurations that help you to bring new ideas into the world faster than ever before. Here's a real network diagram. This is actually a network diagram of Cruise Automation, which is the first commercially released self-driving vehicle into the world in San Francisco. General Motors owns this company. So this is a network diagram I snapshotted many years ago. And what you see right away is a number of small teams, 2 pizza teams, that are singularly focused on one thing. The yellow team is focused on, only local measurements, or only what they call location. The center team is the aqua team. The orange team is geo mapping, and all they do is one thing, software development engineers, one thing every day. And 150 of these vehicles were driving around the streets of San Francisco, picking up data every single day, 1.5 terabytes of data for each vehicle every day. And they were uploading that information and iterating. This is agile design at its finest, iterating on the software every single day, as you can see, the software development engineers. Why does that matter? It takes 4 years to build a new truck. In 18 months alone, this team, using this methodology, were able to create 4 generations of self-driving technology. If you want to go fast, go small. If you want to go fast, think 2 pizza teams, and you're able to make things happen much more quickly. The other thing is think about logical groupings or single-threaded leaders across those various 2 pizza teams. I'm not talking hierarchy here, but single-threaded leaders that have responsibility across natural clusters in order to get stuff done. And if you do that, 2 pizza teams strung together with this single-threaded leadership concept, what you're able to do is bring things into the world very rapidly. If you've ever heard of Amazon Prime Now went from PRFAQ to market, fully scaled market in a major city called Manhattan, which required 600 different service changes in 110 days. Let me say that number again. This went from the back of the napkin as a concept, a discovery, back of the napkin, scaled across the entire Manhattan footprint, which is basically getting groceries delivered within an hour to your home if you live in Manhattan in 110 days. You can't do that unless you have a different convention or a different network configuration called single-threaded leaders in 2 pizza teams. And this is how you move fast. It's agile on steroids in regards to getting stuff to the market and getting there quickly. And then finding out, like 111 days later, you might find out that that's not the right idea, or there's a problem with that, and then you can iterate quickly from there as well. This is how we need to think about development. There are numerous benefits. We increase productivity, belonging, energy, trust. All these matter. But here's the problem. It's very hard to do this virtually. This was a University of Michigan study done a number of years ago that essentially suggests or states that we will earn our level of trust with one another. Brad and I will interact. David and I just met. David and I will interact, and we will, after 5 interactions, we're only going to have 1 today. After 5 interactions, we'll have an optimal level of trust between the 2 of us. That takes 3 times as many interactions in the video world. Just reality, just the way it works. You can do it through audio, just through a phone, but it takes 5 times as many interactions. Now add a new employee to the universe who's working virtually. Now they need to do 20 David interactions, 20 David introductions, and add that times 3, and you can start to recognize why people started to become overloaded and why we started to lose some of our bonding social capital as the pandemic went on. And speed and productivity came along for the ride in the negative side. Cool? And this is what we're seeing. Organizations are just taking on too many priorities. They're just flocking themselves with a bunch of different things, and we're starting to slow down, and they're belonging to too many teams. I will share these slides with you, so I'll flip through them pretty quickly, but we belong to too many teams. We don't belong to a two-pizza team, we belong to many two-pizza teams, and there's an extraordinary shifting cost when you move from team to team if you're trying to drive for speed. So how do you diffuse? How do you diffuse? Well, I'm going to share a different story. This isn't a documentary, a different story, and I'm going to talk about wine to get to my point here. So I don't know any wine connoisseurs in the room or online. If you are, you can share your insights later. But it turns out that there are many different wine regions across the globe, and it turns out that some have greater assets, natural assets, than others. But it turns out that they are fairly competitive with each other as well. So a university professor in Newcastle Business School in Australia wanted to study the Hunter Valley region in Australia and wanted to look at how can we increase innovation. And what she found, along with her research team, was that if you build bridge connections across regions, I think you won't be surprised, you will increase discovery. So just going to technical conventions with technical specialists that specialize in the science of winemaking with other scientists from other regions amplifies significantly the amount of discovery. Here's the trick. If you want to get those ideas implemented and scaled, this is my punchline, it might take you a few beers. In fact, it will take a few beers to make great wine, because if you don't have local trust on the other side, inside your region, your ability to take those new ideas and scale them and seed them and influence with other key contributors or decision makers locally, some winery owner, some vineyard owner, the chances are you won't make anything happen. You just have new ideas. So it takes a few beers to build those relationships in order to truly leverage what you know. And that's how scaling happens. This is how diffusion happens. And this is one of the things that broke down immediately in the early days of the pandemic. We saw it first in the video game industry, where we started to see a depletion of the number of launches. So as your children were sucking up the bandwidth and coming home from schools, and the schools hadn't figured out how to teach them yet virtually, they were sucking up your bandwidth as you were asked to go on Zoom and depleting your bandwidth. And the video game industry was at its all-time peak, and launches started to be delayed like crazy. Why? Because it requires synchronization on the back end. It requires bridge connections across feature sets in order to get ideas into the organization and scaled and delivered into the market. And we started to see that deplete really quickly. Reality is about 70 to 80% of your ability to influence someone is face-to-face, eyeball to eyeball. Your emotions, your energy, your voice tone. We've known that. You can see it here. On the top side, you can see some positive indicators. A handshake, leaning in, is a sign of interest. The head bob is something of curiosity, like I'm curious, what else are you going to say? And then you can see the infamous eye rub is, I'm resetting and I hope you're gone whenever I open my eyes again. You've all had these moments. You don't even realize you're communicating to somebody else, but you know right away, do I need to pivot and shift if it's one of the bottom ones, or am I engaged and can I continue to move forward if it's one of the top ones? We've lost this in the virtual context. We've lost this. And what happens is innovation has gone along with it. It's also important to scale out across the organization. And it turns out that at a 5-to-1 ratio, people deeper in the organization actually have broader range or reach, we would call it, in the network. So, we're losing that level of reach because what's happened is we've lost some of those bridging connections. So I'm going to skip forward a little and get to my last documentary series. And this one actually was a Wall Street Journal article. I don't know, anyone read this Wall Street Journal article by Ben Cohen that was arguing about virtual work versus face-to-face work? And so it was a brilliant article, Wall Street Journal. I think it was 2 years ago now, 2.5 years ago now. And at this particular point in time, the unreleased footage of the documentary, 60 hours, if you're interested, of HBO footage on the Beatles in the making of Let It Be, the album Let It Be, was being reviewed on HBO. Now, I don't know if you have the tolerance to endure 60 hours. I actually did. And you might imagine I charted behaviors and all that kind of stuff, but it's super interesting what happened. At this point in time, what Ben Cohen did was he compared what happened with the Beatles, through their creative process, and what happened with Beyonce, who released out of her own basement, the album Renaissance, which went on to be a #1 seller from her basement. So what's the difference between the two? Here's the difference. One was a delivery, one was pure execution. The songs were written, the creative work was already done, and all they had to do is execute. All they had to do is produce and execute and fine tune with Beyonce, and that's why it took off so quickly. But the Beatles didn't even know what they were doing. If you know anything about the Beatles at this point in time, they weren't a happy family, right? And if you watch the special, it's a really cool segment, one segment where John is late again. John is a no-show. John's not there. There are 2 empty seats, one for Yoko and one for John. And in the band, they've got to release this album literally in 3 weeks. So they were only in the studio for 3 weeks. They've got a timeline to release this album. And at this particular point in time, Paul was the driver. Paul had a song. He was trying to get everybody to catch up with him on this song that he wrote. And George Harrison is sitting in the corner completely pissed off because John's gone again. And here we go. We're trying to be a band and we don't even have one of the key band members. And then, you had Ringo just doing Ringo, whatever he was doing. And then Paul was singing with his guitar by himself. No one else was watching. Everyone else was pissed off. But they're all sitting kind of in a circle. Ringo stands up, goes to his drums and starts hitting a different beat. It changes the way that Paul was singing the song. And, all of a sudden something started to happen. George all of a sudden became interested. George walks over, picks up his guitar and starts hitting a different tune. All of a sudden music begins to emerge before your eyes. And the song that was kind of rough before this, started to emerge. Get back to what you once belong. What you want, what's the word? What you once, I don't know. I should learn the words before I tell the story. But all of a sudden this song emerges and then John finally comes in and the song's already in rhythm, and John plays his role, and this song emerges through serendipity, through cohesion, and the creative aspects of development are very different than the execution aspects of delivery. That's the point. If you want delivery, working virtually is perfectly fine. In fact, we know that we'll lose productivity if we go back to the office and we're not thoughtful about how to separate out and become incredibly focused. Our job is to strip out the noise. Our job is to strip out the noise as leaders and to help our employees focus so they're not distracted. Up to 70% of workers feel distracted in the workplace. That could be good, but not if you're in development mode or delivery mode. And what we got to do is help them focus in on those times. And this is really what this work's all about. How do you catch the flow of work? How do you catch people in the right mode of work, measure it, and try to refocus them so that you don't have mixed mode?